Hey folks, welcome back to another Dice Tower preview. I'm Mark, and today we're taking a look at S.T.A.L.K.E.R, the board game, which is brought to you by Awakened Realms. It's for 1 to 4 players, ages 14 and up, and games generally run about 120 to 180 minutes. Stalkers are brave explorers or merciless treasure hunters, depending on who you ask. Regardless, everyone has their own unique story and reason for venturing into the zone. The mysterious signals echo again through the zone, the same ones spoken only in hushed whispers around the campfire. It all begins here. It's time to embark on a thrilling quest. S.T.A.L.K.E.R, the board game, features high-quality models and top-notch components that transport you, the players, into the harsh and cruel zone. The mechanics have been carefully crafted to provide players with a sense of tension and danger as you tackle the game's challenges. This is an epic story-driven board game. The core narrative will be based on the S.T.A.L.K.E.R campfire stories, and these stories will be your missions. The missions themselves are divided into separate boxes, allowing for a smooth transition into the game itself. So join me as we explore the zone. Now, I was a big fan of the video game, so what really excites me about the board game is the narrative and the feel that it gives you when you try to move around the board, and it is a real mixture of stealth and combat that you have to balance. It's not just one or the other. However, I do want to try some missions that are just stealth to see how well it goes, but definitely you can feel and see how you need to kind of balance the two. And noise in the game is key. You can use noise to your advantage to throw off the enemies and cause them to move in a direction while you go somewhere else. And there's decoys and smoke grenades, all kinds of things you can do to help avoid being detected. But noise is going to be always present. So wherever the spot that makes the most noise, wherever you were perhaps, is going to be what draws them in. So you really try to use noise to your advantage when possible. Obviously in a firefight, that's not going to be quite as possible. But you know, I love the fact that you have these interesting decisions around how you use noise. So all the setup in this game is very, very dependent on what scenario story segment you're playing. Obviously you have your player boards that will hold your different gear and weapons and your character, and you have tokens that represent your actions. So you spend these action tokens and then you're done for that particular turn or that particular round. But this setup of the board that you see is based on everything that comes in the box for that particular scenario, which is really cool. You pull out all the bits, the map, you have some stickers that may get applied based on what happens. You've got different cards and gear and things that are going to go along with it. And you know what? This whole scenario build out is really cool. Now they gave me some 3D buildings put out here as well, but the map itself has lines, orange lines that are really areas that you can't see through, and that is represented at the bottom of these walls as well that you see the 3D buildings here. But in general, you wouldn't have to play with the 3D buildings, but I love how this looks on the board. These scenario boxes also have a deck of environmental cards. They get it placed out in the main map, and they really match the terrain and areas that you're putting them in. And what's neat is that as you interact with those, you'll grab those cards off the board, adding even more narrative, more situations that can happen. And I really found that to be intriguing because what it does is it makes the world feel alive as you interact with it. And of course, there'll be several enemies out on the board. Enemies have their own cards, and there's this nice flow chart that shows exactly what an enemy does in its turn based on if then else kind of conditions. And you'll follow through, and it's really that simple to activate and move these enemies. Now, enemies are going to be able to look in 3 directions. They can never look behind them. But the neat thing is that they will be moving in that direction unless they've heard noise. They'll move towards the noise, and then if they're just moving generically, you'll be able to roll dice to see which way they face in the end. But I love the fact that it is super easy to engage and use the enemy characters because of this handy card. And of course, all the enemies have their own stats and their abilities, what they're going to do when they engage in combat and so forth. So yes, this is a tactical strategy game, but the narrative really draws you in. They have this fantastic Stalker's Memento. This book just leads you through the story and the adventure that you're on. And what's really cool about it is that every round or every turn that the players activate and then the enemies activate, you'll go through a story element that reveals all kinds of different things. It may end with something specific, but this story just is engaging. As you move through each of the rounds, you'll flip to the next one, and it just adds upon the story and what happens in this particular area. Things might be going bad. Enemies are coming in from all sides. The power goes down. all really some interesting, intriguing, again, making the world feel so alive. But I love that it kicks you off, and this first scenario that I played was rescuing Dalek. He helped me, so now I'm going off to help him. This book will also give you specific rules around each of the story segments that you're engaging with, things to be aware of, new cards, and things that might come out. But let me give you a flavor, a little taste of some of the narrative. My favorite part of this, really engaging. I am standing there in the twilight forest, clenching my teeth. The cold of the morning is seeping in. The mission seems simple. Sneak into the camp, find Dalek, and free him. And the first part of the story takes us into a look from the shadows. It is still dark when I emerge from the twilight of the forest near the bandits' camp. All I see are a few buildings up ahead, decrepit and partly ruined. There is light in some windows. Someone is coughing outside. Another is yawning loudly. Sentries, maybe. So you go through the story text, you'll look at the rules, what you're going to be doing as the players, and then the enemy will activate. And then you're going to come to the end of this particular story segment, and it'll show you what to do at the end, and you'll turn the page to the next segment. The next one is going to be lights out. So I love, again, making this world feel even rich and alive as you move through the story. Throughout the zone, you'll also find anomalies. Anomalies are really cool because they contain perhaps dangerous artifacts, but artifacts in general that you can hopefully acquire. Now, the way this works is that you'll have a series of cards for the anomalies. Once they've shown up, some might be visible right away, some might show up later, but you'll have a tableau of cards. You'll find the appropriate card that you're going to deal with this anomaly, and you'll flip it over and see what is required. And you'll be reaching into the token bag, trying to get the designated tokens in order to succeed and pull an artifact from this anomaly. Now, these artifacts are fantastic, but some of the characters will do better, are better served at dealing with anomalies than others. And obviously, it's inherently dangerous to be stepping into these anomalies or reaching in trying to get all the different types of artifacts, but it could be worth it. And also, through this entire world, through the zone, you have a zone map. You will be referencing the map as you complete missions and so forth. There are stickers that you'll be applying to the map, showing your progress and so forth as you move through the game. And the map is also used to give you a wider view of the zone, giving you opportunity between missions, what you might go to next, and what you might interact with. And of course, your characters will have a series of actions that they can tap into. And each character card will have specifics around them and how they work. But movement is key, obviously, as you try to sneak around the complex or whatever you're doing. And wherever you end will determine how much sound gets generated. So if you move 2 spaces, you're going to put marker of 2, showing that you've created 2 sound events. And there's 2 different levels of sound. You've got your basic small sound, and then a 2+, a red one, that gives you even more loud sound, especially if you're in a firefight. Those will start to show up. And what's interesting is that the enemy will start to move towards those sound on their turn, and the first enemy to arrive at one, if there's no one there, will clear one of the sounds. So that could really dictate where the other enemy goes, because maybe it was close in sound to 2 different spaces, but it doesn't matter the distance between. The enemy will always go to the loudest space if it is within their range. So again, you have tokens that represent your actions. Once you spend those, then you're done on your turn. But you can go in any order you want. You don't have to spend them all at once. You can actually trade off back and forth between different players doing various things, coordinating what you're doing, and that's key here, especially a cooperative game, right? So the different types of actions, you've got short actions, you've got long actions, you've got instant actions and free actions. Specifically, like some of the free things are, if you're peeking in a door, you'll see the environmental card will show just a bracket with nothing in the middle, which means it's a free action just to look in and take a peek. And these action tokens are going to be specific to your characters. Some will give you additional movement, some will give you a success, some will give you extra dice to roll, and re-rolls even, when you're performing various actions in the game. So you have to be very mindful of which of the tokens you're spending. And obviously at times you're going to have to attack the enemy, and when you do so, you've got to make some choices depending on which character you're playing as well. You might be a sniper and you could use a long action in order to go for that headshot and remove the enemy after a certain number of successes. So all of the characters, depending on which weapon you're using and how you're engaging with the enemy, you'll be rolling a series of dice, trying to get successes, keeping in mind that you could have an automatic success with one of your tile tokens or your action tokens. So you'll be rolling those dice trying to succeed in either wounding or hurting or removing the enemy altogether, obviously. That's the key thing for sure, to get them out of there. But of course, it's going to cause all kinds of noise to do so, which might be okay because maybe you want to draw enemies to a certain place on the board. And another type of action you might do is prepare, where you're taking stuff from your backpack and putting it into more of a ready status. All kinds of different types of equipment here. You know, bandaging, because you might become wounded or bleeding, that you might need to bandage that up. And there's other types of ammo and weapons and things that you're going to be engaging with. The really interesting thing is that there's so many types of options for your character and how you put together your gear. And they even give you a handy book about all the different types of characters and things that you're finding in the zone that you can actually reference and put together your teams, because it is campaign based. So you hope to keep everybody here and assemble it as you move through the adventure. And when you're rolling to attack, you could potentially jam your weapon by getting the skull icons on the dice when you're going after these different enemies. And there are so many different enemies. You've got, in this particular prototype, I've got shotgun enemies and rifle enemies, but I also have a boss level character as well as Snorks. And those characters are very true to the video game, because when they show up, they're not just after you. They may attack the other enemies that are out in the field, and you might use this to your advantage, trying to lure them to an area to go after them and distract them while you go off and complete the objectives of the mission. And of course, enemies will be spawning throughout the course of the game. As you interact with different spots, you'll flip over the token to see if any enemies show up, so you have to be very careful. You don't want to just blindly run into a room. Peeking into a room is definitely key, because inevitably more enemies are going to show up. And it's going to be dependent on the setup for the game, how many of these tokens go out, and so forth. But after you complete all your actions, then it's time for the enemy to move. And the enemies have this Overwatch token, which just means really they're on high alert and they can see in every direction except behind them, so they have good peripheral. And there is line of sight and there's range based on the character or the enemy that you're using, and all the enemies will go in turn order. Again, using this handy algorithm or flow chart to show exactly what they're doing. It's so key, but each enemy card will show how that specific enemy will work and behave and who they'll go after. But noise is key, like I've been saying, and you'll have to be very mindful about where that noise ended up. What's the most loud spot on the board? So when the enemy does attack, you could potentially become wounded. Now there's different types of wounds in the game, and you can only have 3 or you're eliminated, right? So you have wounds that are just basic wounds. You have cards that you represent, put at the bottom of your board, and on the other side is an effect. It could be a physical effect or radiation. Radiation is another thing that can happen in this game. You have Geiger counters that you'll be using to track the radiation on your character, which is really cool aspect. I love this dial so much. So it's very thematic to the video game as well. And you know, there's zones that you move through. You have to be careful not to get too much radiation. So wounds are going to come into play, obviously. You have things like armor and ways to mitigate different types of wounds coming in. If you're bleeding, like I said before, you could use a bandage to stop the bleeding, because otherwise you're going to continue to get wounds. So it really is key to stay on top of that. Well, it just gives you that sense of maybe I should have been more stealthy in this particular area. So the enemy algorithm, the AI for the enemy, where they're facing, you're rolling a dice to determine north, south, east, west. We've got a little north, south, east, west dial to show where you are in the world. Is just really key. Facing where the enemy is facing is 100% key, because you could sneak behind them in various instances, just bypassing them, and they won't know you were there. So, you know, there are different tactics to take for sure. And you know, this was just a basic look of what's going on, and I only got to experience the very first scenario really, and I didn't fight the boss yet, but I'm gonna go back and play that. But I did play this first one, and it was really interesting. Went through it a couple times, and I really want to try a full-on stealth game, like I said, because I think that would be really interesting to see if I can use sound better to my advantage. And again, based on the scenario, it's really going to depend on what you're trying to achieve for that particular story element of the game, and you hope, obviously, to be successful through the whole campaign. All right, folks, just a reminder once again, this has been a Dice Tower paid preview, and everything you've seen here has been in prototype form, so keep a close eye on the campaign for any changes that still may occur. Now, with that said, you know, I was a fan of the video game, and they really did a great job having you engage with this world in the same type of narrative, giving that dark and gritty that's going on and the different aspects of the story elements as you interact with spaces and the environment cards, just advancing the story even more forward as you try to find the secrets of what's going on. And the anomalies work really well, how they laid that out. I was really curious how that was going to work. So they did a fantastic job just having you engage with those in a creative way. I like reaching the bag. It becomes very tactile as you try to deal with these anomalies and so forth. And you know, again, I love the narrative. It really just sucks me into this type of game. But folks, ultimately, if this looks like something of interest to you, I'm sure they'd appreciate your support. So I think that's it for me. And until next time, we'll see you at the table.